Today, I want to pull the curtain back on our garden, the preserver's jewel box. If you've been following along, you might already know the general concept, but today we're going deeper. I want to talk about what this garden actually is, where the inspiration came from, and how the design evolved as we got closer to build week. We'll talk parameters, the constraints that shape the garden, and the pivots that happen along the way. We'll dig into the river of canned goods, the custom arbor, and the table. And yes, we'll talk about plant selection. So let's dive in. This is the preserver's jewel box. Welcome to the Relish Gardens podcast, where we have conversations about the intersection between the garden and your life and how all of those things are intertwined. How to care for your space, how to prune, basically everything that's related to the design, development, and keeping of a garden. I'm Claire Liddell Hanna, the founder and lead designer at Relish Gardens, where we build, design, and maintain beautiful gardens. Let's dig in. I've been toying with this idea of using food in the garden since the beginning of my kind of experience with the show gardens. I tucked it away because I've done a lot of food gardening. I wanted to be able to kind of explore other types of gardening. So for our first and our second garden, we really focused in on like totally different themes. For this year's garden, we decided to kind of go back to that first garden that we had been toying with. The concept of the preserver's jewel box is from this idea that what you kind of bring from the garden and eat from the garden, preserves and different things. I would think of them in the winter as like the jewels, it's like these little tasty bites that you have during the winter that are from your garden that, generally isn't producing in the winter unless you have a really great greenhouse. Anytime I'm developing a garden, I'm kind of thinking about it within multiple perspectives. It could go this way, it could go that way, or it could go this way. This is pretty and this feels, food centric, and these kind of aesthetics feels very food oriented. The reality of it is it wasn't quite landing for me, and I kind of had to take a step back. And I think that's when I really started looking into jewel boxes and like thinking about how do I build a garden that isn't just functional. It shows a way to have a food garden that's beautiful, that even if you don't have like acres and acres of land, that you can incorporate this. As I was kind of trying to develop this garden, looking at different jewel boxes, there's the classic Tiffany box, which is more of, a box that wraps one particular jewel. But generally, like a jewel box is really divided into sections, and it's usually very squared and sectioned off. And so with the design of the garden, the layout of this garden is mimicking that. This garden's not a homestead. It's not even just a vegetable garden. This garden is really kind of an exploration about how to treat edible plants the way that we treat ornamental gardening, and to kind of blur the lines between the two and kind of elevate food plants in a way that is more than just about the functionality of the food plants, and kind of elevate that beauty that comes with plants that produce for us. I love the idea of homesteading. It's not an option for most people. It's something that a lot of people want to incorporate bits and pieces of into their life, but not everyone can do that. A lot of joy can be found in the simple act of picking raspberries out of your garden in June. I mean, I will always have raspberries in my home garden. I love the act of just wandering out on a warm, early summer day and picking raspberries. There is a loveliness to that act. And so we don't always all have the opportunity to live on a homestead, but we can, plant some of those things, and we can build some of this act of preserving and food gardening and these things into our lives if that's important to us. This garden is showing how to incorporate it into the life we have, not the life we may have later. I guess it's bringing it to now. This whole garden was developed from this perspective of preserving and kind of honoring that tradition. Everywhere you look in this garden, there's edible plants, and whether it's the beehives that we're hosting or the table that is centered around on, just like on a shared meal. But this garden is as beautiful as it is functional. And the goal is to think of food gardening as not just a purely functional activity, but as something that you can create beauty from, even if you have a small space. While you may not be able to grow everything that you'd ever eat, you can grow quite a bit. This is the smallest garden that we've done with relish. It is, I think, probably the second to the smallest garden on the main show floor. It's definitely packed and it's tight. You're not going to feed an entire family, but you could do a lot in a small footprint. What we keep coming back to it with relish is this idea of living a garden-centered life to create spaces that people can participate in, whatever their perspective is. And for a lot of people, that means having the ability to interact with their garden in a edible way and to bring bounty from outside in and to share meals from the garden. I love cooking from my garden. I haven't had parsley growing in my garden for a couple years because my garden beds have been torn up, and I miss having access to all of those little things, going outside and just picking something. It adds a delightfulness to a meal to, go pick some calendula flowers and throw them in your salad, or add some extra herbs that you can't get at the grocery store, or pick some raspberries to throw on your crepes in the morning. This is about adding little bits of joy into your life. I love nothing more than having little kids come over to my garden and pick through the raspberries. And, the delight that you see on their faces when they're like, oh, I found one. And when they taste it, and, you just don't get that from the store-bought package of raspberries. You're often picking through them to make sure they don't have any mold on them. But because by the time they get to you, they usually do. I love putting some sort of edible plants into my garden to create that space for people to kind of peruse and to forage. This isn't about like a high yield, high production performance garden. This is about having regular delight from the space and having a garden that kind of gives back a little bit. It's funny because I had this whole asparagus patch in my garden and I couldn't figure out why my asparagus was not producing. The reason why I wasn't having any asparagus was because my dog had figured out that asparagus that has just popped up is incredibly sweet and quite delicious. And he had been going over there and eating them. I caught him out there one day. We never got them because he would eat them before we could get them. I mean, there's reasons why all the best cooks out there have a garden attached, or they have a really deep and developed relationship with somebody who grows their food, because they realize that the closer it is from the source, the better it tastes. I think the thing that I'm kind of enjoying this year is using different types of hardscape material, the copper around our table. We're using a lot of brick in this garden. I mean, brick is such a classic styling with copper, but we're using, it's like 3.5 by 3.5 by 8. And so it's like a larger format brick in like a couple different shades. I'm in like a really big brick moment right now. Those are all from Mutual Materials. But I kind of was surprised. I think it's something that's been brewing for a while, but how beautifully it kind of worked with what we're doing for this garden and how contemporary brick can be and also just timeless. I'm kind of just like fallen in love again with brick and the texture and color it brings to a space and just a different shape. We've been using a lot of large format pavers. There's been a lot of that in the garden for a very long time. And I don't know, I'm excited to kind of use some of these more like timeless classic pieces for a different aesthetic. I think that the through thread for this garden is that all of the components are really kind of classic or old world even elements that we're kind of playing with in a more contemporary fashion. From the plants to the brick to the copper to, just the idea of preserving itself. These are all from a bygone era. People use brick, they preserve, they do all of these things. It's not that it's gone out of style completely, but we're using it as a way to like reimagine or just like to rethink the perspective on these kind of old materials and components. Every garden that we build has a set of parameters. The thing that is always challenging about doing a garden for the garden show is that you can really box yourself in with those parameters if you're not careful, because, accessibility during this time of year is challenging. And one of the things that is the hardest is getting color. Obviously we're not going to have any golds in this garden. it's not a literal translation, but thinking back to preserving and then looking at, jewel boxes and looking at the Tiffany box, and you have this bluish green color of the Tiffany box. And I just kept coming back to copper, and copper has that, like, as it patinas, it has that kind of that similar color to that Tiffany jewel box. And anybody who's done a lot of preserving is probably familiar with copper pots that you'll use for jam making because of the way it conducts heat. And so for me, copper felt like it makes sense the most in this garden. And as I often do, I like to use salvaged materials. And we found salvaged copper that had been taken out of an old kitchen, which I thought was so fitting because it's from a kitchen and it's going into a kitchen garden. And it has that like beautiful blue-green patina on it. This year, the color for the blooms is really focused in on kind of the colors that we see in preserved foods a lot. There's green in preserved foods, but a lot of what I keep coming back to is these jams and preserved tomatoes and salsas. It's lots of reds and oranges and even some pinks with the raspberries, because our trees aren't fruiting this time of year and they're not in full bloom. We really wanted to kind of use that color palette from the fruit of the garden that would be reflected in the color palette of the blooms in the garden. And so we're really using a pretty limited color palette for the blooms. There's little bits of yellows here and there, but the vast majority is within those four colors: reds, pinks, oranges, and whites, and everything kind of in between those. I always like to develop a strong set of parameters on what can go into the garden because I want it to feel cohesive. And when you're pulling a garden together, it can be challenging to say no to something because none of it's necessarily bad. It just may not fit into this kind of story that we're trying to tell with this particular garden. I will often have a no list in my gardens, things that don't make it in, colors that don't make it in order to kind of develop a really strong perspective. And this year is pretty much everything that's outside of those colors. And then within the hardscape, it's the colors in the brick. And then the copper has obviously the blues. And so we're really playing off of those. There's a lot of color happening, but there's also a lot of stuff that isn't in this garden because it just didn't make the cut. We're also doing an arbor, using some industrial panels salvaged to incorporate those into the garden. They're built into the wood arbor that spans from one side to the other. It's largely just aesthetic, but I think they're pretty. I'm always looking at different ways to like incorporate interest into a space. And I think often using salvaged materials helps create something that is unique. And so we are showing just another way to use salvaged materials in a space and to create beauty. So all of the painted materials are in the color of the copper patina. This arbor has had many iterations. Initially, it was kind of like a freeform style with just the fruit trees. And then I thought about doing a metal arbor and then kind of really funky arbor made out of rusted rebar. I had so many different ideas about how to go about doing this. But I think that the hard thing about being on the show floor is that the whole garden show in the garden floor has theatrical lighting. And that theatrical lighting, depending on where it's hitting, it can really play with the perspective of things that are tall. And so sometimes, especially if it's like a black metal piece or something like that, it can get lost. And I really wanted to make sure that we could see the space and understand the space in the context of the show floor. But really my goal for the arbor was to use the arbor in a functional way that could show how you can use it for kind of sectioning off growing areas for a food garden, and then use it functionally for the plants. And then also to create a vantage point from either side where you look from one side to the other and you create a view. The goal for this garden was really to create that perspective and to think about what the viewer is going to see when they're looking from one side to the other, and to narrow that viewpoint by kind of drawing them into looking at the garden from this perspective. And so anytime we're doing a garden show, I'm always thinking about how are people going to see and experience this space, whether or not they're in it, if they walk into the space, or if they're just walking around it. And so the arbor is really a way to kind of like narrow perspective so that the viewer and the people observing the garden, they can't just take the garden in by standing back. They have to actually interrogate the space and look at it from different perspectives. And you could grow things into them. You could grow vines into them. You could grow your peas into them. While the vast majority of this garden is segmented and broken up into sections intentionally to kind of reflect the jewel box, the thing that is outside of that is the river of jars, some empty, some not, that are kind of incorporated throughout the landscape. The bounty of last year's garden highlighted throughout the whole garden. And until we get into the space, it's all theory. I've never run a sea of preserved foods through a client's garden before. I love to put up a few jars of this, a few jars of that. This year I've done a lot of it. And that was all to prepare for this particular garden. The fun thing about the garden show gardens is that you get to play with reality a little bit and to like think about a garden space in a way that you may not do in your own space, but to think about it as a temporal installation. I think of it as like when you're watching a fashion runway, the clothes may be worn outside of that particular runway, but the way that they've been styled or the rest of the like theatrics that come from that show, I like the idea of incorporating elements that may or may not be implemented in a garden one for one, and to like think about different ways to kind of explore perspective in the garden show that you might not actually do in real life. But you could incorporate jars into a real life garden. I've seen it. Every food lover's garden should have a large table. The table here is a key component of the garden. The development and the design of the garden kind of took me into a different space initially because I found this amazing, amazing table that I fell in love with. And oh my gosh, I was like, I have to have this table. I have to have this table. I priced out the table, and the table was $16,000. And every garden has its constraints, and the $16,000 table was not going to fit into this space. It was this like beautiful turquoise blue, like the color of the Tiffany box, and it was this beautiful Italian terrazzo, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so gorgeous. And so I was like, okay, how do I kind of bring this like gorgeousness into this garden? And so I started exploring different types of terrazzo, and there's a lot of really bad terrazzo out there. Let me just tell you, there's a lot of really beautiful terrazzo, and there's a lot of not beautiful terrazzo out there. And I kind of had to abandon my like beautiful terrazzo table and to think about something different. So we built the table using the copper and incorporating that. Any of these gardens are a collaboration between multiple partners. And this year we're partnering with Rain Tree Nurseries, which I absolutely love. And I've planted several of their trees. And anytime I'm looking for like a fruit tree that is kind of out of the ordinary, I go to Rain Tree for that. Anytime I'm like, ooh, I want that variety of that type of plum, I go to Rain Tree because they have an amazing catalog. It's all mail order. I think their list comes out in July generally of what you can pre-order. And then, man, like a few days in, that people have been waiting for that particular variety because it is gone. That happened to me with the Mirabelle plums. I had to like wait for another year before I got the ones that I wanted. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mirabelle plums, but they're these beautiful French small plums. They're just like little jewels. In France, you go and you'll see them in the pastries and the displays during a certain time of the year. But I love to pickle them and preserve them. And then I love to serve them with like a blue cheese or a cheese plate. And it's just like that acidity and the sweetness and then the blue cheese. It's amazing. And so, yeah, I get those kinds of trees from Rain Tree. But like the papaya, oof, it's got like fruit on it. It's so pretty. I love the leaves of the papaya. I'm actually very allergic to papaya, so I will not be eating the papaya. But it's a very pretty plant. To me, it's purely ornamental. and I will not be eating it. One person's edible is another person's ornamental. And then our friends at Rainy Day Bees, we love them. They do hive hosting in the greater Seattle region. If somebody needs help with their bees on our properties, we always refer them to Rainy Day Bees because Peter and Amy are fantastic. Their honey is delicious. I think food gardening, it just goes hand in hand with beekeeping, you know? We often hear about like pollinator gardens, and just adding some pollinators to the garden is a great way to develop that space. So we have 4 of their hives in our garden. If you have questions about different things, you can always reach out to them. And if you just like honey, they make delicious honey. They have this like creamed honey trio, but it's this hot cocoa honey, and it is so good. You just put like, I just put like a scoop of it in with a cup of milk, of hot milk, and it's just like, it's like hot cocoa. I mean, it's so yummy. It's so, so yummy. And then the other thing that I really, really, really love is their spiced cream honey. It's like almost like a chai or something. It's something that they've developed outside of just, honey. They also have all of these other things that are delicious. We also, in my house, we also really love their creamed honey. It just like glides on. So that's my plug for my friends. I love their stuff. I love their beeswax candles, and I've loved watching their business develop and grow over the years. It's been really cool to see them develop it. We get 3 days to load in, to build, and to put the whole show together. There's always something that happens that you have to just like think on your feet and develop something different. 3 days is not very much time. It's pretty intense. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun to be able to have a space to talk about the things that we're thinking about and to connect with the people, that see our gardens online, and to just talk gardening with everybody and get together and see all of the people in this garden community and kind of just celebrate everything that is gardening all at one time. That's it for today's episode of the Relish Gardens podcast. If you love this conversation, make sure to subscribe. We've got new episodes every week. And if you know a gardening friend who'd love this, send it their way. Sharing the show helps grow our little garden loving community. Until next time, I hope you find something in your garden to truly relish.